What makes this episode so horrifying is how real it is when I watch it again as an adult. Watching it as a kid, I probably just laughed at Squidward's stupidity, how he works himself up over nothing. But now it feels like I've been there before. That inescapable, dark spiral of paranoia that comes when I overthink things. It's truly terrifying. It starts with Squidward in one of his normal moods, sad and broody. Nothing new, but it sets the stage for the lunacy soon to come. He watches the tranquil spring day and frolicking jellyfish from inside the Krusty Krab, or what he calls a prison of high cholesterol.
And here I am, trapped in a prison of high cholesterol.
Which is one of my favorite Squidward lines of all time. To further agitate Squidward's already volatile mood, SpongeBob rings the service bell repeatedly, testing to see if it works. Weirdly, this unnecessary repetition of a task by SpongeBob is a foreshadowing of exactly what Squidward will do later, but in a larger, much more unhinged fashion. Squidward questioning loudly why he's there in the first place, it's Sunday after all, and there are never any customers on Sundays, already starts working himself up. In a fit of rage, he smashes the cash register, triggering a chain reaction of the series of chaotic events to come. First, a barrage of coins hit the floor, and Mr. Krabs, doing his normal Krabsy stuff in his office, goes on high alert. Because, for him, the sound of money is like a fire alarm. Squidward, trying to return order to the mess he created, tries to pick up the coins, but a distraught Mr. Krabs slaps him out of the way, calling him a barbarian, and gathers the coins, which he calls his babies, rather ineffectively with his massive red claws. At this stage, Mr. Krabs freaks out so much that you're probably thinking this video should have been called the episode that completely broke Mr. Krabs, and I don't blame you. He screams about his clean money now being soiled, which I found hilarious. Because one of the first things my mom taught me was not to put money in your mouth because you don't know where it's been. But to Mr. Krabs, money is sacred. So he rushes to the sink to wash the floor and probably Squidward's grime from his babies. But one dime goes rogue and after a little dance around the rim, plunges into the drain, which causes Mr. Krabs in a moment of utter distress to push his massive claw into the much smaller hole of the sink. Long story short, in an attempt to free himself with some help from SpongeBob, he loses both arms and gets bonked on the head by an array of heavy objects. And off to the hospital it is with him and his detached arms. And that's where he makes one of the biggest mistakes of his life and leaves Squidward in charge.
Squidward, I'm putting you in charge of things around here while I'm gone.
Now, Squidward is actually an extremely responsible dude, so what he does next, he only does because he's convinced there will be no customers that day. He leaves SpongeBob in charge and runs off to run some managerial errands, which is code for he's going to relax his butt off for the rest of the day. I'm not saying it's right, but I probably would have done the same. As he walks home and thinks about the day that lies ahead for him, filled with relaxation and pampering, we start to see the first speck of guilt and uncertainty enter his mind, when, for a second, he feels bad for SpongeBob working alone and quickly shrugs it off. But that one little speck of guilt is all your brain needs to start a maelstrom of anxiety. Suddenly, mid-walk, Squidward imagines what SpongeBob might be up to and is struck by a horrifying vision. In his mind's eye, he sees SpongeBob handing Patrick change for a single quarter, not in coins, but in the form of towering heaps of cash. Realizing he never taught SpongeBob how to make change, he rushes back to the Krusty Krab and opens the cash register. Although all looks well, he decides to test SpongeBob's change-making prowess by asking for change for $1. SpongeBob surprises him by giving him a myriad of options, all perfect, and Squidward, mad at the world as always, stomps off home. But I like to think on the inside, he's just mad at himself for having this anxiety, which I can definitely relate with. Finally, he finds some peace and takes some time to sunbathe, wearing that stupidly ridiculous umbrella hat of his, which I now wish I had as well. Anyway, instead of just enjoying himself and embracing the choice he made not to be at the Krusty Krab, his imagination takes him on another wild ride. And he envisions SpongeBob being so bored at work that he passes out behind the cash register. Not unrealistic if you ask me, except for the part where this causes the whole restaurant to catch fire. Completely unrealistic. But how many times have I had similar dark fantasies come to me when trying to relax or go to sleep? It's like your brain telling you left the stove on while you sit in the dentist's chair, unable to speak. I think this happens to a lot of us because of guilt over small things or just anxiety caused by the ups and downs of life in general. Squidward is at odds with himself. He sprints toward the Krusty Krab, convinced he needs to check on SpongeBob, but stops, realizing he's probably just being paranoid. Then, as if fate wants to torment him, a fire truck speeds past, sirens blaring, which in Squidward's mind is undeniable proof that something disastrous is happening back at the restaurant. Without another thought, he dashes back to the Krusty Krab, and although there's not a flame in sight, he empties a fire extinguisher all over the place, his nerves on edge. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Remember how earlier I mentioned SpongeBob repeatedly ringing the bell just to see if it works? That bell ringing becomes a metaphor for Squidward's spiraling paranoia. Each time he convinces himself things are fine, a new bell rings in his mind, reigniting his fears. Like SpongeBob with the bell, Squidward keeps testing his own anxieties, unable to let go of the thought that something might go wrong if he doesn't check and check again. And the spiraling paranoia of him is definitely driven by guilt. When SpongeBob asks him how his errands are going, he falsely thinks SpongeBob is insinuating that there aren't any errands, which, well, there aren't. But the truth of the matter only adds to his guilt, anxiety, paranoia, and anger for not being able to still his mind. Back home, he gives himself a stern talking to, which we all know never works. You just end up putting yourself more on edge. He even talks to himself in the mirror and says, "Repeat after me. You will not go back to the Krusty Krab." But instead, SpongeBob answers saying, "I will destroy the Krusty Krab."
You will not go back to the Krusty Krab.
I will destroy the Krusty Krab.
And this is where all hell breaks loose. Squidward runs to the Krusty Krab and back to his house, over and over, countless times, each time being met by SpongeBob asking him if he's finished those errands. The battle in Squidward's mind has now completely manifested in his actions, driving him to the brink of madness. He confronts SpongeBob, accusing him of being up to something sinister, even though SpongeBob has done nothing wrong, at least nothing outside Squidward's own spiraling imagination. Realizing once again that his paranoia has taken over, Squidward decides he needs to go to extreme lengths to stop himself from giving in to these frantic urges. He barricades himself inside his house, layering it with locks, chains, and even police tape. When we finally see his face, well, he's not doing so good. Squidward looks like he's aged 30 years, with one eye bulging wildly and his face sagging, especially around his long, wrinkled nose. Yet there's a manic grin stretched across his face, as if he's finally achieved peace by physically isolating himself from his paranoid thoughts. But of course, there's one major flaw in his plan. You can't lock out your own mind. Things start to get really weird when he goes to take a relaxing pink bubble bath, hoping to soothe his nerves. But soon, he hears SpongeBob's laughter echoing through the house. Paranoia flares up once more, and now he's convinced that SpongeBob has escalated to spying on him, trying to catch him slacking on his errands. But the only person escalating is Squidward himself. He mirrors his own feelings of guilt on SpongeBob, and ready to catch SpongeBob red-handed away from his post, he looks out the window and he realizes the sound he hears aren't SpongeBob's laughter at all, but just branches scratching against his house. Then he thinks he sees SpongeBob behind the bath's curtains, but it's just the toilet. And finally, something in Squidward's brain goes haywire, because he sees SpongeBob in the bath with him, once again asking him about those errands. SpongeBob disappears beneath the foam and Squidward follows, but we now see him in a more animal form. He's much more octopus-like, which probably means he's now completely on autopilot, thinking with his animal brain on, not rationally. He sees SpongeBob disappear down the drain and immediately acts on his paranoid instincts. Naked, except for some foam and his shower cap, he bursts through the barricaded door and heads straight for the Krusty Krab, which leads him to this unhinged scene. Completely broken, Squidward now realizes that the place he's most relaxed is actually behind the cash register, and SpongeBob is so kind as to give him his square pants to wear for the rest of the day. There's a nice little extra metaphor at the end of the episode, where SpongeBob realizes that the restaurant sign was set to closed instead of open, reminding us to be more mindful and not jump to conclusions. Things aren't always what we believe them to be. In this episode, we watched as Squidward's own mind became his greatest enemy. Each small choice, leaving SpongeBob in charge, imagining worst-case scenarios, and spiraling into paranoid fantasies, builds up, reflecting a cycle that's all too familiar in real life. How often do we, like Squidward, find ourselves trapped in a loop of overthinking, unable to quiet the anxious voices in our heads? This episode cleverly highlights the futility of trying to outrun our own thoughts. Squidward's attempt to barricade himself away from his anxieties is a relatable but ultimately doomed strategy. In reality, just as Squidward realizes we can't lock out our fears and insecurities, they're always with us, even when we try to hide from them. By the end, we see that his safe place might actually be in facing these anxieties head-on, symbolized by him returning to his familiar spot behind the cash register. The final reminder with the restaurant's sign, how it was mistakenly set to closed instead of open, underscores a powerful message. Sometimes we only need to change our perspective to break free from our own self-made prisons.